This happened to me when I was a kid. I grew up in a military family and lived in the Middle East for a significant portion of my life. Because of this, we frequently traveled to different countries because of the low cost and proximity. On this particular vacation, we flew into Cairo, Egypt. It was late at night and we were staying at the Marriott Hotel, which had a taxi/shuttle service that was supposed to pick us up. For some reason, our driver never showed, so we were forced to find a regular taxi to take us there, which took forever to find that late at night. We finally found one that was offering us a pretty good deal. They don't run by meters. Instead, they just give flat rates that they choose, and headed towards the hotel. We finally got to the hotel, exhausted as it must have been 3 a.m. by this point. Our driver helped us get all of our bags out and get settled, and offered to pick us up the next morning and take us to the Great Pyramids, which was on our agenda for a super cheap rate. My parents agreed and decided on a time for him to come the next morning. Everyone was ready for the day, excited to see how crazy it was going to be. Our driver was outside waiting for us, leaning against the car like someone in an old movie. I'm a blonde-haired, blue-eyed girl that had a deep tan at the time. When the driver saw me in the daylight, he gave me the creepiest, most unsettling look that sent chills down my spine, even as a 10-year-old. I knew something wasn't right with him. Nonetheless, we got in his taxi and headed towards the pyramids. He continued to try and talk to me and joke around with me the whole ride, something I found to be extremely creepy and bold since both of my parents were in the car. We get super close and there's an entrance that people can go through and walk the long distance to the pyramids, and there is an entrance that taxis can go through. You have to pay to see them. Strange, but true. Our driver keeps making jokes about my blonde hair and blue eyes and bringing up that he could get me into the pyramids for free, so my parents wouldn't have to pay the extra ticket price. We laughed it off and my parents paid him, said thank you, and began to exit the taxi. I don't remember how it happened, but at some point after I got out of the car, he did too, and directed me towards his trunk. I was confused and thought we had forgotten something, so I stayed behind as my parents walked towards the gate to get whatever I thought we had left. The driver pops the trunk, but there wasn't anything in it. He grabbed my arm and put a hand on my back, trying to push me into the trunk, and said, "I'm getting you in for free," over and over again, as I resisted. Naturally, I freaked out and screamed out to my mom and dad at the top of my lungs, terrified. When they heard me and noticed I wasn't behind them, they started sprinting back to the car. When the driver heard me scream, he immediately let go of me, closed the trunk, and drove away just as my parents started to run to me. I was crying my eyes out, terrified knowing that a taxi driver tried to put me in his trunk and drove away the second I screamed for help. He is the reason that I am still terrified of taxis, Ubers, and any car service of that nature. I've never really been a fan of vacations. I've always felt weird about staying in a room that wasn't mine. But after my final semester at school, a few friends and I decided to plan a trip to Lake George, and despite my many complaints, we decided to rent a cabin together. There were 4 of us total, so for the week it ended up only costing us about $200 apiece, and to everyone else, it seemed like a steal. As for me, well, I was uncomfortable from the very beginning, and it turned out I had a good reason to be. I just didn't know it yet. The first red flag for me came when I met the cabin's owner. He was there when we showed up to give us the keys, and when we introduced ourselves, I couldn't help but notice his eyes. Even though we were all talking to him, he wouldn't stop staring at me. At first, I thought he was just being polite and making eye contact, but even after he left us to enjoy the cabin by ourselves, it was like I could still feel him staring at me. I kept looking over my shoulder to see if he was still there, even when I knew it was just my friends in the cabin with me. It was a feeling that I couldn't shake for the entire day, even when it was time to go to sleep. The cabin had 3 bedrooms, only one of which had 2 twin-size beds in it. I ended up drawing the short straw when we were choosing rooms, so that meant my friend Pat and I had to share the 2-person room. That ended up being fine with me, though, because I was still feeling uneasy when it was time to lay down, and if I was in a room by myself, I don't know if I would have gotten any sleep. I was especially glad that I wasn't in a room by myself when I was woken up by a sound that I swore came from outside the window. I sat up in the bed and looked over to the window and listened to see if that was actually where I heard the noise from, and just as I was about to give up and lay back down, I heard it again. It sounded like there was a sort of shuffling outside of the window, as if someone was walking around right outside of the cabin. I woke Pat up and asked him if he could hear anything, and right away he confirmed what I was hearing, but he was a lot calmer than I was. He said that it was probably just an animal, and he told me to take a look for myself. I reluctantly approached the window and pulled back the curtains, and to my surprise, no one was there. I took a few deep breaths and then ended up falling back to sleep about an hour later. The next day I did my best to relax as I tried to enjoy myself on the vacation, and while I was outside near the lake, that wasn't a problem at all. But every time I stepped into that cabin, the sense of dread came back, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. So I tried my best to stay outside and enjoy the wilderness as much as possible before we all had to go back to the city. Eventually, though, I had to go inside because I promised to make dinner for everyone that night since Dan made lunch for all of us. And as I was in the kitchen, I noticed something that sent me running. As I was filling one of the pots we brought with water, I looked up above the sink to look out the window when my eye caught something small hanging from the corner of the window above me. It was a camera. I pointed it out to my friends, and they all just shrugged it off like it was nothing. They tried to tell me that everyone who rents out their cabins or houses uses cameras to keep an eye on things. They said that there was probably no one watching it, but something still seemed weird about it to me. And to make myself feel a little better, I reached up and turned the camera away from me as I finished cooking. By the end of the day, I couldn't wait to get home, but I didn't want to ruin the vacation for the rest of my friends, so I just tried my best to keep my cool, though that soon became impossible. That night I had a harder time getting to sleep, and after a few hours of just laying in bed, I sort of gave up and just started reading to pass the time. And since I was awake that night, I knew I wasn't crazy when I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps walking up to the window. It was the same sound I had heard the night before, but this time I was certain it wasn't an animal. I didn't wake Pat up this time before going to check the blinds because I didn't want whoever it was outside of my window to hear me and hide like last time. Instead, I slowly got out of my bed and as quietly as possible, I walked over to the window. I took in a deep breath before drawing the curtains back, but that didn't prepare me for what I was about to see. I screamed for everyone in the cabin to wake up as I looked out that window and made direct eye contact with the man who rented the cabin to us. Pat sprang out of his bed and ran over to the window in time to see the man running away from the cabin and back into the darkness of the woods that surrounded us. "Who was that?" he asked with his eyes as wide as mine. I told him it was the owner, and he was trying to watch us through the window. My other two friends came rushing into the room to see what was wrong, and when we both explained to them what we just saw, we all decided to end the vacation early. We hung out in the living room with the lights on until daybreak, and then began packing the car as fast as we could before leaving. I was around 15 or 16 at the time, and my mom, dad, and I were on a family trip to New York City. It was a really good trip at first. We visited the Statue of Liberty, Madison Square Garden, Times Square, etc., and for the most part, it was a normal vacation. But towards the end of our trip was when everything went to shit. It was our last day there, and we were trying to get back to the airport, so we decided to take an Uber. A couple minutes pass, and a gray Civic pulls up to the sidewalk we were on. I remember noticing that he had Lyft and Uber stickers on his car in multiple places, almost excessively. It kind of felt like he was trying to prove that he was our Uber. Moving on, we were running late, so I'm guessing my dad didn't really pay attention to the license plate because this guy was definitely not an Uber driver. He was a lanky African-American man wearing clothes akin to rags and looked like he was drugged out, but at the time, nothing seemed off to us. Again, we were running late, and what happened was the least of our expectations. The ride was normal until we got to the airport. We all expected him to get off the highway and let us off. He didn't. Instead, he casually continued down the highway past where we wanted to be dropped off. This was when my dad noticed that the man didn't have a meter or his phone set up with the Uber GPS open. We were starting to get worried, and my dad asked him in a stern voice, "Excuse me, where's your meter?" The man stayed silent, Flustered, he asked once more, this time yelling, "Where's your meter?" Again, no reply, but at this point the man started dashing down the highway, weaving past other cars and just driving very dangerously. We were all panicking. My mother was crying and praying with her rosary clutched firmly in her fist, and I was in shock. I froze up. I couldn't even cry or scream as much as I so desperately wanted to. I was completely immobilized. This continued for a while, driving down an unfamiliar road to God knows where, with the car only getting faster and faster. I started having those classic end-of-the-road type thoughts like, holy shit, this might be it and there's nothing I can do about it. Luckily, we were saved. I don't know if we passed by it or if someone in a car we passed had called the cops, but we soon heard sirens blaring behind us, and we were being tailed at high speed by multiple police cars. One of the cops had a megaphone or something to amplify their voice and screamed out for the man to pull over. Obviously, he put up a fight and the police had to actually cut him off for him to finally stop. The police helped us out of the car and got all our things from the trunk while putting blankets around us and telling us that it was going to be okay and that we were safe. At this moment, I felt the biggest wave of relief wash over me that I have ever felt in my life. The police gave us a ride back to the airport, and everything went as planned from that point on. But holy shit, am I glad that I never had to find out where this guy was taking us and what he was planning to do with us. Just thinking about it still gives me goosebumps. The worst vacation that I've ever been on had to be when I went with my mom and dad to a resort on the Greek island of Santorini. I was 14 years old, and I remember my mom freaking out about anything I did because she didn't think it was safe for a young girl to wander around the resort alone. Her hovering wasn't the worst part, though. You see, our vacation at the resort was for the entire week, and over the course of that week, I noticed something that made everywhere I went on the island uncomfortable. There were two older guys that seemed to show up everywhere that we went. At first, I thought that maybe they were following my family around and they were going to try to con them or scam them into some sort of tourist trap. But there were a few times that I was walking to or from the room by myself and I noticed them. So after a little while, it became really clear that they were following me, and I would have told my mom and dad about it sooner, but I was afraid that I would ruin their vacation, and I know they worked really hard to save up for it, so I decided that it wasn't a big deal. After all, by that point, they hadn't even gotten close to me. Still, though, I didn't like that everywhere we went, I had these two guys just watching my every move. Sometimes it was like they weren't even trying to hide it. Then finally, the last day came, and we decided to celebrate by going out to a local restaurant and eating a really nice meal. I was happy for two reasons. The first being that I got to go home soon, and the second being that I figured the two men wouldn't follow us off the resort. I couldn't have been more wrong, and I found that out the hard way. I was walking with my mom and dad through the streets, and I wasn't looking where I was going and ended up tripping over something. I stopped for a second to see what it was, and it turned out to just be a small stone, but it managed to distract me long enough to where I was separated from my parents by a small crowd of people. That was when I saw them. The two men that had been following me all week had stalked my family out of the resort, and now that I was away from my mom and dad, I knew that I was in trouble. I saw them both start to walk a little faster so that they could catch up to me, and I didn't hesitate to scream before I turned to run away. I tried to push past the crowd of people, but I couldn't make it through fast enough, and within a matter of seconds, I felt someone grab onto the back of my shirt and basically lift me off the ground. I continued to kick and scream as one of the men grabbed me and tried to run down a nearby alley. I looked around hoping that someone would stop them, and I saw a few shocked looks on some people's faces, but it seemed like no one was stepping in to help. That was when I heard my dad screaming out from the crowd, "Hey, that's my daughter!" he yelled. I screamed back at him and my mom to help me, and I continued to try to work my way out of my captor's grasp. I don't know if it was my kicking and screaming that slowed the man down, or my dad trying his hardest to get to me. But once the man who grabbed me saw how close my dad was, he dropped me and made a run for it. My parents both ran over to me and consoled me before deciding that it was best to return to the resort and order room service for the rest of the night. After that, We all just stayed in our room until it was time for us to go home the next day.